Lucky you.
36 best
Tuned
holes in
into
golf.
Alternate Shots podcast,
Barney's Army.
where we talk about golf,
Sandy.
poker,
James Bond.
horse racing,
Double.
classic movies.
Zenyatta.
We have no script.
Down the stretch they come.
We are glad you joined us.
Frankly, my dear, I don't give a damn.
Thanks for joining Mark Frost, The Greatest Writer, Part 2.
Country Club was the scene of the Open in 1913. That Open put golf on the front pages of our newspapers for the first time, and small wonder. Francis Ouimet, an almost unknown 20-year-old Boston amateur who had caddied at the Country Club, fired the shots heard round the world when he defeated Harry Vardon and Ted Ray, the great English professionals, in a dramatic playoff.
Ladies and gentlemen, from the Alternate Shots podcast, we are so very thrilled to have with us today our special guest, Mark Frost.
There was a great event, getting ahead of this a little bit, after the book came out in 2012, I think it was. Ken had been notified by the Golf Hall of Fame he was going to be admitted that year. The First Tee organization, which has a yearly tournament at Pebble, and they had decided to invite Ken and I as two of the guests of honor for the event. There was a tournament, and the fun part was the tournament was the first day at Pebble, big dinner that night. The next day we recreated the match, and they had brought in Rickie Fowler and Bubba Watson to play Harvey and Ken. There was going to be Freddie Couples and Davis Love to play Ben and Byron. And at the last minute, Freddie's back went out, so Nick Watney came in and played with them. So the only people who were invited were the people who were at that dinner the night before, all the donors to the first tee. President Bush was there. He flipped the coin to start it. I was seated at a table with President Bush on my right, Arnie on my left, and Ken over here next to Arnie. It was a star-studded evening. And Jim and I had talked about this before, because Arnie and Ken had a bit of a dust up, as you remember, from going all the way back to, I think it was Masters. Ken felt that he'd gotten a favorable ruling by kind of browbeating an official on an embedded ball. May have cost Ken the tournament. The other part of the background of this is Ken was not in great health, and he was going to be inducted to the Hall of Fame in a few months. And Jim and I looked at each other and said, "Look, they may never be in the same room again, for all we know. Let's try to get them together." And so we did, and they ended up talking for 5-10 minutes together, and we felt like, okay, we may have helped that a little bit. So the next morning, we all show up 7:00 in the morning at Cypress. Cool, clear, frosty morning. They've all got the players all show up. Nick Watney, who was sort of playing Hogan, brought his Hogan cap. Davis, I thought, made a good Byron. That was good casting. Bubba actually made a good Harvey, as the kind of the happy-go-lucky, anything for a laugh kind of guy, loose as a goose. And Rickie was a very good Ken, kind of focused, serious, and a great iron player. So, we cast it pretty well, I thought. And the spooky thing about it, and we walked the course. I walked with Jim and a couple of other guys. It went 18. It was almost exactly the same score as the match had been in 56. The pros ended up winning one up on 17, not 18, which is where it was decided before. The only eagle in the match had been Hogan on, I think it was 10. He holed out from about 95 yards with a pitching wedge. Nick Watney holed out with a pitching wedge from about 100 yards for an eagle.
Wow.
The only eagle on the match. All four guys in the original birdied 13. All four guys in our match birdied 13. It was spooky.
That is
And
spooky.
everybody felt it. Everybody felt it. It was an absolutely magical afternoon. And it ended
And Eddie Lowry lost the bet again.
exactly. I'm
Was
sure
Ken out there?
Ken stayed for the first couple of holes, and then he was riding around on a cart. He wasn't able to walk it, but that's a day I'll never forget.
It's like the day they brought Bobby Jones to Wingfoot, and
Yeah.
everybody tried to make the putt that he made in 1929. They said, why don't you give it a shot?
I already made that putt.
Back to Bobby Jones. I feel no one maybe knows Bobby Jones other than some diehards at Augusta National better than you.
Maybe Sid Matthews.
How would you
Sure.
defend if you said Bobby Jones? There's a lot of debate.
Mhm.
Is the greatest golfer of all time. Describe how you would defend that.
I would build the argument that if he wasn't the greatest, and I think there's an argument to say that he was the most important. I used the analogy in the greatest game that Francis was like John the Baptist, and Bobby arrived like our Lord and Savior in terms of what he did, how he elevated the game. He was inspired by Francis. His relationship, obviously, with Eastlake and the caddy who had taught him, the Scottish caddy, is a fantastic story. But when it came down to the heat of battle, and he was mostly a match play player, there was nobody better. We always talk about era versus era, and it's an impossible question to answer. But he had a game that would have lived in any era. He was also an extraordinary human being with English lit major, a master's in mechanical engineering, and a law degree. The most well-rounded person to ever play the game in some ways.
And he played it in a tie.
And he played it in a suit and tie with, for the most part, whippy shafts. I mentioned Sid Matthews, who's a colorful guy who lives in Atlanta and has written a bunch of books about Jones. He's got a museum of Jones memorabilia that he's collected over a lifetime, which he generously shared all of it with me. And I went down to visit him, and he took me out to a little course, very old course in Thomasville, Georgia, southern Georgia, just over. He lived in Jacksonville, I think. And we played around with 2 sets of Bobby Jones's clubs, which he owned. Now, I had never tried to play with hickory before. I could barely get the ball off the ground. So the thought that Jones did what he did with these clubs that had a sweet spot smaller than a dime, to me, spoke volumes. To actually have the experience with the clubs in your hands and go, I have no idea how he did this. It's a completely different swing. His mastery of the mental side of the game, which cost him dearly when he was playing. As you know, the stress that he went under in these tournament weeks, he could lose up to 20 pounds in 3 days. The flesh melted off him like a candle when he was in the heat of battle. In more ways than one, winning the Grand Slam nearly killed him, as it became this consuming event really for the entire sporting universe at that time, the year that he did it. I think for all those reasons, that he was never afraid of anybody. The only guy who could really, you could say, was on the same level as a player, was Hagen. And Hagen had a different kind of way of going about the game. He was devil may care, and complete. It couldn't have been more or less chalant, as a player. He was the life of the party. We also know that he was also pouring his drinks into the plants a lot as he was getting everybody else loaded before or after a round. But He was no dummy. And, Saracen had started to come along, but wasn't really on the scene yet with the same force. And a lot of his great matches were against other amateur players. And he had some great matches with those guys, but there wasn't any other titan of the game at that point that as an amateur he would go against. Nobody approached him. Francis,
nobody really pushed him.
He didn't need a push. He was so obsessed with perfection. And we know what happened at St. Andrews the first time he went over, when he quit the game in a kind of juvenile fit, as he put it, tore up his scorecard and walked off the course. To come back and become the embodiment of everything that the game could be, and the living exemplar of the game's values, which I think he lived to the end of his life, and what he did for the game, keeping Augusta going during the Depression, starting the Masters. He was really responsible for the next big bang. I mean, if what Francis did was the atom bomb, Bobby was the hydrogen bomb, and in terms of his impact on the development of the sport. So all in, and I know, and I've met Jack and I've spent time with him, and he's an amazing guy. And I would put him a very close second, and then I'd put Tiger right in that same foursome, certainly. But if you had to play a match tomorrow, life or death, I think I'd want Bobby Jones playing for me.
Wow.
Against anybody.
How did he get hooked up with Alister MacKenzie? Because that was a brilliant combination there.
That was done through Marion Hollings, who had had this idea for Cypress, and she had hired MacKenzie. She knew him. He wasn't quite the titan of golf course design that we think of now. Bobby worked with him, and he was in many instances a kind of creative partner in creating that course. But she was the one who put them together and fostered, and she had a hand in it too. She was a force in Northern California golf and society circles, and it was her dream, really, that how that club got off the ground. So I think it was just one of those things. It was like when everybody came together to make Casablanca. It was greater than the sum of its parts. I have a special fondness for it because I played it a bunch, and I think its beauty is unmatched. But Cypress is my favorite course. And if that, the old question, if you had one round left to play, where would it be? That would be my answer. It means a lot to me personally. And I think it's a great story because it was really also the birth of golf on the West Coast. That plus what then happened with Crosby and starting the clam bake and supporting the Western Tour, which was really the start of the PGA Tour. So it's in it, you see it's the chrysalis for what became professional golf today.
With support from big timers, nobody was bigger.
Nobody was bigger.
Oh,
yeah,
right.
because he had a broader reach because of his recording career. They were both obviously in the movies and on radio, and had come out of vaudeville, but Crosby had a kind of genius. I mean, he was similar to Bobby Jones in a way. I mean, he invented magnetic tape recording. He created the first kind of usable commercial tape for recording his own songs. And nobody was bigger. It wasn't until Elvis and then the Beatles came along that anybody sold more records than Bing Crosby. And
Still didn't outsell White Christmas, I don't think, for quite some time.
no, it's and you think about the road movies, which I can still watch today and
Sure.
laugh myself sick. Those guys were incredible comedy partners. I mean, there wasn't anything Crosby couldn't do. He was a little bit like Dean Martin in that respect. He didn't look like he was ever working very hard when he was an actor. Same with Dean, but they were fine actors and very truthful actors who gave you the real deal. If you ever watched The Country Girl with Grace Kelly,
Absolutely.
Yeah.
he could really bring it. So yeah, pretty amazing guys.
Yeah, they were both Bing Crosby and Dean Martin are extremely likable on screen.
Yeah. And in real life, I got to meet Dean too. And he was not the roue that he pretended to be on stage. He was in private, he was a delightful, kind of low-key guy. I had a good friend who knew them both very well, both Dean Martin and Jerry Lewis. Actually walked into, there was a little restaurant Dean used to go to on Santa Monica called Carmine's. And my friend who's passed away, was a great producer who produced Greatest Game Ever Played, actually, knew Jerry really well. And they were doing something together, and they walked into Carmine's, and Dean and Jerry hadn't seen each other in over a decade. And he got to witness, I mean, the minute Jerry saw him, he started tearing up. And he talked him into going over, and he sat with them for half an hour and listened to their conversation. Dean had lost his son, who died he was in the Air Force Reserve, and his plane had crashed, a thing that he never really recovered from. That was the thing that killed Dean. But to be only one step removed from the reunion of Lewis and Martin was pretty cool.
So
And it makes these guys human to hear these stories.
Exactly.
You know, I have a nephew who's a prominent MLB player. I'd never seen the inside of pro baseball until he was at that level. And you forget that these guys have to get up every morning, and they hurt, and they've got to push through, and they're, particularly baseball, it's a freaking marathon. They've got to play 162 games, and then they go to work and people scream at them.
Yeah.
You know, it's like, I think about, okay, I'm getting up in the morning, I'm working on my new book. Am I going to invite 12 people in to heckle me while I'm writing? I mean, it's
you really want to say it that way?
Yeah, you can't find a better word for that. What, you know, where's your thesaurus when you need it? You know, Billie Jean King famously said, pressure is a privilege. And I think every great athlete would agree with that if they're up to it. There are very rare individuals who don't seem to feel it. Only a few. I think Nicholas is one of those guys. He got better.
Derek Jeter.
Derek Jeter was that way. Tom Brady.
Tiger.
George Brett.
Tiger. Yeah, George Brett. There were guys who just didn't care. It only made him focus.
Made him better.
More. Yeah, made him better. That's a rare person.
What was the story about Marilyn Monroe going over to entertain the troops and coming back and telling her husband at the time, Joe DiMaggio, that he'll never know what it's like to stand in front of 50,000 people cheering for you?
Yeah.
It's like, how well, really? Joe DiMaggio?
Yeah, really? Do you know what my last name is? Yeah. Yeah. I just watched, there's a good documentary. I actually wrote a movie about her in the 80s, based on a book called Goddess by an Irish journalist. That was the first book that told the whole story of her life and her involvement with the Kennedys. And there's a pretty good documentary called The Mysteries of Marilyn Monroe.
Well, they were all ill-fated as time has showed us.
It's our Anthony and Cleopatra. You know, it's our great kind of tragic mythology about the boys of Camelot and the Golden Girl, and it all came to grief for all of them. It's an astonishing story. Yeah.
Well, you've met Palmer.
Mm-hmm.
You know, you didn't meet Hogan, or did you?
Didn't meet Hogan.
But you know enough about Hogan that you know him. You know enough about Palmer. Is this Ludwig Oberg, the next combination? Ben Hogan, Arnold Palmer. He has the charm, but he has like the near perfect golf swing, and maybe he's got the ethic, the work ethic.
He's from my heritage. He's a Swede.
Easy. The answer to that question lies in his golf swing, with one very specific motion. It's this motion that is, in many ways, the secret to a
played with Ludwig in the first 2 rounds of Bay Hill this year, and then I played with him the final round of John Deere when he shot 63. And he is very, very good. He's got a lot of ability.
Maybe.
Does he have the appreciation of the fans as well?
That's the key. That was the key to Palmer. He had the human touch. He could have been president. I think.
Yes, he could have. Yep.
He had the thing that retail politicians all long for, and very few possess. Hubert Humphrey had it, believe it or not. I met him when I was in high school. I interviewed him on a show. You could meet him, and 15 years later, he'd bump into you at an airport, and he'd remember your name. Arnie was like that. I've never met a more charming guy. My dad was a huge Palmer fan as I was growing up, so I like he did. I rooted for Palmer, and we all kind of resented Nicklaus's entrance. This big football-looking guy from Ohio who played sort of Germanically without emotion, because Arnie was such an open book. They actually had a deep, abiding respect and affection for each other, which both of them told me. And I thought that was pretty cool that survived down the years. I mean, the game needs that right now. The game needs another figure.
And I've told this story before, but coming from the 18th green to the locker room, he signed every autograph, every until they were gone. It wasn't like he kept walking until he got there, until there was no one left. And I stood with him while he was doing that. He was just, I've never met anybody like him.
You would be able to know that it was all genuine. He genuinely loved people and credited the fans with his success. I mean, he said, I couldn't have done this without the support of the people who were behind me, and I wanted to give back. And amazing man.
And he told his compatriots at the time that they should have the same kind of appreciation for the fans. He didn't tolerate guys who were not understanding of how important the fans were.
Exactly. Well, that was the birth of the Pro Tour. I mean, his victory at the Masters really is what kicked it off. That was the first year it was televised. He captured the heart of golf fans around the world.
Yeah, so walking around with him and Arnie's army, and it really was. When he knocked the putt in, the noise was like you were on the sidelines of a Giant game.
Tiger had a similar effect on his crowds, but he didn't like them. He didn't like being. It was a different reason. Being around them. Because he'd grown up in a fishbowl. They had a similar kind of effect on the game. That's why they all sort of belong on Mount Rushmore.
Tiger was born a winner with the urge to win.
And he was programmed from birth to capitalize on that by both his mother and his father.
Well, Palmer wasn't programmed. Palmer was told to hit balls in the rough. Don't you dare hit practice balls in my fairway by Deacon. And
exactly.
And I don't know about Jack Nicklaus. I think he grew up a little bit more.
They were a little more middle class, yeah. And Jack played other sports. He was a football player. He enjoyed. He was a good basketball player too. So golf was sort of it was a game that, unless you grew up a caddy or around a golf course, or you were a member of a golf course, why would you play golf? How would you have access to it?
No.
It's a select few who can make it to the top of that game. And I do worry about the future of where we're going with it. I think I am a bit of a traditionalist, and the live golf thing has always rubbed me the wrong way. I just don't see how this resolves. The way kind of backdoor deal that ended it, I think still has a lot of questions about it that have to be answered. I don't think we know the full extent of what went on with his gambling.
You never know with anybody the full extent.
Alan Shepnick, he published a big book about Phil recently. He thinks, that Phil was in a pretty deep hole.
Which is too bad, because he's a very popular player and he had that kind of charisma and everything going for him.
The time I spent with Phil, I really liked him. I just thought, he's personable, funny, intelligent, playful. And he did have a common touch for people. I mean, a lot of people thought he was Eddie Haskell, behind closed doors. This will crack you up, as we all do. You have a favorite foursome that you play with, right? And in the 90s into the 2000s, I did a lot of work with I mentioned him earlier, the guy who'd known Dean Martin. His name was Larry Bresner. He was a partner, and his partner in comedy management and producing is my best friend, a guy named David Steinberg.
Oh yeah.
Who is not David Steinberg, the Canadian comic. This is a guy who became the manager of Robin Williams and Billy Crystal and Whoopi Goldberg and Bette Midler and a bunch of other people, and was a big part of Robin's career for a long time. I met these guys because I was hired to write the sequel to Good Morning Vietnam at Disney in the late 80s. And we hit it off right away, and I became friends with Robin. And David is a great golfer, great fan of the sport. His nephew is Mark Steinberg, Tiger Woods fan. That's his agent. So we played together always, and we had a favorite foursome in the 90s into the early 2000s. Me, David, remember Tom Poston?
Sure.
Yep.
One of my favorite actors.
Great actor.
Maybe my favorite person that I've ever known in show business. We were very close friends. The funniest, sweetest, nicest guy in the world. And our fourth was Super Dave, Bob Einstein, the comic, who is he's no longer with us, a comic genius. Albert Brooks is his younger brother.
Wow.
He was a writer on the Smothers Brothers show, along with Steve Martin and George Carlin and the other David Steinberg. I mean, he created the character of Super Dave, had that great show on Showtime. My favorite foursome, these four guys, always hilarity, always laughs, always fun. David had just gotten one of the first titanium drivers, and he hit a shot, and it just had this perfect sound. And Tom just went, "Oh my God, it's like a diamond falling on a marble floor." And without a beat, Dave said, "Mom coming home on New Year's Eve." We had a laugh at that quality at least once around. It was that kind of fun. Well, Bob was he played Marty Funkhauser on The Best.
Mark,
So
we
lost
really
him a few years
appreciate
ago.
this.
Yeah.
This is unbelievable. I hope we get a chance to have you back.
Yeah, I have 100 more questions.
Sure.
You come to Wingfoot anytime. You know who to go
I will.
to.
I'm on the East Coast a lot.
How would you
Sure.
defend if you said Bobby Jones? There's a lot of debate.
Mhm.
Is the greatest golfer of all time.
He was the most important. I used the analogy in the greatest game that Francis was like John the Baptist, and Bobby arrived like our Lord and Savior in terms of what he did, how he elevated the game. But he had a game that would have lived in any era.
And he played it in a tie.
And he played it in a suit and tie with, for the most part, whippy shafts. As you know, the stress that he went under in these tournament weeks, he could lose up to 20 pounds in 3 days. The flesh melted off him like a candle when he was in the heat of battle. In more ways than one, winning the Grand Slam nearly killed him. I think for all those reasons that he was never afraid of anybody, to come back and become the embodiment of everything that the game could be, and the living exemplar of the game's values, which I think he lived to the end of his life, and what he did for the game, keeping Augusta going during the Depression, starting the Masters, life or death. I think I'd want Bobby Jones playing for me.
Wow.
Against anybody.
Thanks for joining us
Casper,
today.
Billy Harmon,
We really appreciate your
Double
feedback.
Indemnity,
And please
Arky,
subscribe to the
Two
show
Outer,
and hit
Claude
the bell
Harmon,
icon so you get notified
Movie
of
Classics,
new episodes.
Mark Gable,
Hit them
Odd
hard
Job,
and hit them off.
Best 36 Holes,